I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard Russell Library at the University of Georgia and Young Harris College. Our guest today is Dr. Roy Rowland, former member of the Georgia House of Representatives and a member of Congress from Georgia's 8th District. Welcome, Dr. Rowland.
Bob, it's a real pleasure to be here, and I appreciate this opportunity.
Before we talk about you and your medical and political careers, I'd like to ask you this question. What shall I call you? Dr. Rowland, Representative Rowland, or Congressman Rowland?
Well, I worked real hard for that MD degree, so, you know, it's nice being called doctor. It was a high honor and a privilege to serve in the Congress and in the State House, and, you know, I like those. So why don't you just call me Roy?
Roy, okay, Roy. Wrightsville, Georgia.
Wrightsville.
Was it your dream when you were growing up in Wrightsville to become a doctor and a congressman?
Well, it was my dream to become a doctor. As a matter of fact, my grandfather was a pharmacist. He had a brother that was a pharmacist and a brother that was a doctor, and his father was a doctor. So I kind of grew up in my grandfather's drugstore, and he had a lot of influence on me. So my early ambitions were to become a physician, and I think I probably decided on that when I was probably around 12 years old. Getting involved in politics was a lot later in my life.
Well, tell us about growing up in Wrightsville.
I think growing up in Wrightsville was one of the best situations that I could have had, or anyone could have had during that period. It was back in the 1930s. It was during the Great Depression. Times was hard. My father was an attorney. He had a problem making ends meet. Nobody had any money much, but we always had enough to eat and a place to stay. And maybe we didn't know any different, but we didn't aspire to have much more than what we had because we were pretty comfortable. It was really a great situation. Both grandparents on my father's and mother's side of the family lived within 2 blocks of us, and I had uncles and aunts, cousins that lived all around. It was just, it was really a safe place to grow up.
So you graduated from Wrightsville High School?
Yes, graduated from Wrightsville High School in 1943. One thing that I was very proud of was being an Eagle Scout. I attained that award in 1942. I didn't get the Eagle Scout badge until 1945 because the war was going on, and they didn't have courts of honor back then. But after graduating from high school, I went off to school at Emory at Oxford for a couple of quarters, and everybody was going into the Army. This was 1943, or the Navy, or the Marines, and so I enlisted in the Army in 1944, and I wound up in the infantry. That was not exactly where I anticipated going, but I'm very proud of my military service. I was in the military a little over 2 years. Went with the 13th Armored Division to the European Theater in January of 1945, and was involved in 2 campaigns in the Rhineland and Central Europe, and got the Combat Infantryman badge and received 2 Bronze Stars, one for valor and one for meritorious service. And I'm real proud of my military service, and really proud that I got through without getting injured. Yeah. So anyway, after that, came back and went back to school. Went to South Georgia College for a couple of quarters, and then came here to the University of Georgia for my pre-med.
Mm-hmm. And then you went to the medical college.
That's correct. After a couple of years here, I was accepted to the Medical College of Georgia in Augusta in 1948 and graduated there in 1952.
What happened after you got your medical degree?
Well, I did an internship and a residency in Macon, at the old Macon Hospital, which is now gone, and spent about 6 months in Swingsboro with a friend of mine, went in partnership there, and then came back to Dublin, and that's where I've been since that time. Came back to Dublin in the latter part of 1954. So, and I practiced medicine in Dublin after that.
For 24 years before you ran for the House of Representatives.
Well, yeah. The state representative, Wash Larson, who had that office, decided to run for Congress, and it left an open seat. And so this was in 1976. And so I decided that that I was going to run for the State House. Then, in fact, I hadn't thought a whole lot about it, and then all of a sudden I said, well, you know, I think I'll do this. And I told my wife, I think I'm going to run for state representative, and she said, well, I'm not surprised, because my father's side of the family had always been involved in politics. My grandfather was in the state legislature, cousin in the state legislature. My father was a district attorney and a Superior Court judge. Brother was a magistrate who was also a lawyer. So there was a lot of politics in my family.
Was it hard to do that and leave at least part of your medical practice?
At that time it wasn't, because I had pretty well decided that I wanted to, well, when I ran for the State House, that was a little different, because that was just a part-time proposition, and I really liked politics. I liked the debate and the adversarial things that you had to do in politics, and so I enjoyed that, and I decided after an opportunity came to run for the U.S. House that I'd like to make it full-time. So it really wasn't hard for me to leave my medical practice, although let me say that's wonderful. I could not have wanted my medical practice to have been any better than it was.
So you were elected in 1976 over two opponents in the primary and one in the runoff. Tell us a little bit about that race.
Well, that was for the State House. There were two attorneys who were both good friends. That happens a lot in politics. You were good friends running against each other. One was Leon Green, who lives just down the street from me now. I did then. The other one was Ralph Walk, whose family I treated. So it was really kind of odd the way that worked out. But Ralph lost out in the primary, and I was in a runoff with Leon. And I recall that after it became apparent to him that I'd won, he was very gracious and called me and congratulated me. And we've never had any ill feelings at all. You know, if you get mad with somebody in politics, before long you'll be mad with everybody. So you don't get mad with people in politics.
That's right. So you went off to Atlanta. What was your first reaction to being a member of the House of Representatives?
Well, I was kind of awed at being there. To see how the government really worked on the state level. I found out there were a lot of great people there, a lot of people that I made a lot of good friends there. Tom Murphy, I particularly grew fond of. Everybody knows Tom was a pretty abrupt fellow, but always I thought very fair. I'll tell you a little incident that I had with Tom Murphy. Georgia had not passed Certificate of Need, which they had to pass in 1977, or maybe it was 78. But anyway, Georgia was going to lose a lot of federal funds if they did not pass the Certificate of Need legislation for mental health and addictive diseases and a lot of different things. And so George Busby was the governor at that time, and this was on the last day of the session. And they thought this would be brought up as just kind of a perfunctory thing. There wouldn't be any problem about it, but I was very much opposed to the Certificate of Need and made that known. And I had the opportunity to get in the well. It was around 11:30 in the evening before we would adjourn at 12. And to speak against the Certificate of Need. And I took the well, and I decided that I would just stay in the well until the legislature adjourned. And we wouldn't pass a certificate of need. Of course, that was not a very smart thing for me to do, because the governor would have to call a special session, I suppose, to get it done. But Governor Busby sent his people up to the floor and talking to him, trying to get me out of the well. And Tom Murphy gave Al Burris a note to hand to me. He said, "Get out of the damn well." Well, you know, I had a chance to be a martyr or get out of the well. You know what I did? I got out of the well. So Certificate of Need passed just before the session ended that year.
Well, in your opinion, after all these years, has Certificate of Need been good for Georgia?
I'm not sure. I'm really not sure about that. It was good for those who had it, and it wasn't good for those who didn't have it. So I did some research on it back then, and at that time I came to the conclusion that Certificate of Need really did not do what it was supposed to do, stop the capital expansion of healthcare facilities, capital outlays for healthcare facilities. I never was sure that it was a good thing for us to do.
Incidentally, how would you define your political philosophy?
I say I'm moderate conservative, maybe.
Good. Well, back to your career in the House of Representatives, you got some pretty good committee assignments. Those were assigned to you by the Speaker, weren't they?
They were. You're talking about in the State House now?
State House.
Yes. Yeah, the Speaker made those assignments, and when I came, Al Burr from Marietta was running against Tom Murphy for Speaker at that time, and Tom Murphy asked Ben Jessup from over in Cochrane to contact me about voting for him, and I told Ben that Al Burr had already contacted me on a couple of occasions, and I told Ben that I would like to support Tom, but I really did want to get on the Health and Ecology Committee. Speaker wasn't inclined to put doctors on that committee. But anyway, he made a commitment to do that if I would vote for him, and so I made that commitment to Tom Murphy in exchange for a seat on the Health and Ecology Committee.
You think that was a good trade?
I think it worked out all right. I admire Tom Murphy as a Speaker. I mean, he was kind of an abrupt guy, but I thought he was always fair in dealing with the members of the House, and fair in his political philosophy too. I like Tom Murphy.
Well, you mentioned earlier about political friends and political enemies. After that race between Murphy and Al Burris, as heated as it was, they became very good friends.
They did. That was amazing. Al worked his way back into a leadership position. He became the whip after he challenged Tom. So Al and Tom became good friends again. So again, you can't keep your chip on your shoulder in politics.
As a member of the Health and Ecology Committee, you helped to address many of the problems that involved in the distribution of health services back then. We often hear the question, is health care a privilege or a right? What do you think the answer to that is?
I've never thought that health care was a right. I thought it was a responsibility of society to provide health care to those who couldn't afford it. But I wouldn't say that it was a right like the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But I think the government has a responsibility to help those people who are not able to help themselves.
Well, in addition to Health and Ecology, you're a member of the Ways and Means Committee.
I was.
A very powerful committee.
It was, and had a good chairman, Marcus Collins. Marcus always said he didn't have much education, but Marcus had a lot of common sense, and I thought he made a real good chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and I enjoyed serving on that committee.
Was that part of your trade with Murphy?
No, it was not. That happened later.
And then you were on the Rules Committee, most powerful committee in the House.
No, I was on the Judiciary Committee.
Later, weren't you later on the Rules Committee?
Bob, I think you probably jogged my memory. I think, yes, I was. My last term there, I was on the Rules Committee. Yes, I'd forgotten that. Bill Lee was chairman of that committee. That's correct.
Yeah, well, tell us a little bit about the Rules Committee and how it works.
Well, I'm not sure that I can recall all of that exactly now, but the Rules Committee became all-powerful during the last 10 days of the session, because if a piece of legislation had not passed out of the Rules Committee and made it through the House, during that period of time, it would not be considered by the Senate. So I was always a scramble to get the legislation out of the Rules Committee, particularly the last 10 days of the session.
The legislators had to come in there and do some begging.
They did. They really did have to do some begging to get it through. But as I recall now, it turned out pretty well most of the time. I don't recall many people going away really angry about
what the outcome bill on the calendar.
Getting the bill on the calendar.
You mentioned Bill Lee. If you will, let's take a minute and talk about some of the other legislators who were in power during that period of the 70s and 80s.
Okay. Well, one person that I really admired was chairman of the Health and Ecology Committee, was Sidney Marcus from Atlanta, who later ran for mayor of Atlanta. I thought he was really an outstanding person, and we've already mentioned Al Burris and Jack Cornell from Augusta, who was a speaker pro tem all of the time that I was there. Wayne Snow, who was chairman of the Judicial Committee, I believe in Chickamauga, someplace in North Georgia. I admired him too. There were a lot of people in the state house that I really thought were outstanding people and did a good job for the state of Georgia.
You served with Joe Frank Harris, I believe. Joe
Frank was chairman of the Appropriations Committee. I did, and Joe Frank was all business. It seemed like he was always running around doing something, but never too busy not to stop and talk.
Well, you served in the State House 3 terms.
3 terms.
For
right.
6 years. And then in 1982, you decided to run for Congress.
Yes.
What prompted that decision?
I had originally thought I wanted to run for governor, and in fact got a campaign underway and raised around $35,000. But Speaker Tom Murphy told me that Joe Frank Harris was going to be the governor. That's who he was promoting, and that there was no point really in me running for governor. And Bo Ginn was running at that same time, and I think Norman Underwood. There were 2 or 3 other people I can't recall right now, but I wasn't sure what to do, and I had some friends tell me that they didn't think the current congressman from Georgia was doing a very good job, and they thought it was a good possibility that I could be elected if I decided to run against him. And so I had a friend did a little poll out of Dublin that gave me some information that made me believe that it was possible to unseat the incumbent. So that's when I made the decision to run for the U.S. House.
Mm-hmm. In the Bloody Eighth.
I guess that's right, the Bloody Eighth.
Why do they call it the Bloody Eighth?
I don't know. It's such a long district, such a big district geographically. I'm not sure why they called it the Bloody Eighth, but I do recall it being called that.
Well, you were elected many more times to Congress, but what do you remember about that first election?
Well, I remember that I didn't have a campaign organization. I had some friends that were helping, and it was kind of like our campaign was held together by baling wire, I guess you might say. And people vote mostly against something, not for something, so they were really voting against the incumbent, I think, as much as they were voting for me. And there was one other person in that race, and so I got into a runoff with the incumbent. When the incumbent's in a runoff, they're in trouble. And so later, Billy Lee Evans, who was incumbent, told me that he should have stopped before he did, because he realized he wasn't going to be able to win. But what I remember was the night that the final returns in, and I'd been elected, and we at our campaign headquarters, which was in a shopping mall and a vacated grocery store building. The people came from all around, and a lot of ladies brought. It was like a picnic. I mean, it was really a great occasion. And my kids came back. I have 3 children, and they came back, and it was just a great occasion that night. And got some calls of congratulations. It was all of a sudden a kind of a different world. But let me tell you something that was really interesting after that. After I was elected, it was kind of like somehow or another I was different to my friends. I felt kind of like I was alone or something. I'd call my friends up, and it was like they didn't want to talk to me. It was kind of a weird feeling. I remember that very distinctly. Of course, that that changed later, but I recall it was kind of an uneasy time.
Well, the Bloody Eighth was certainly a large district. How were you able to campaign throughout that whole district?
Just get in the car and ride and ride and walk and walk and ride and ride. And let me say that my wife, Luella, I couldn't have been elected without her. I mean, she was there. Every morning we would part ways. She would go one direction and I would go another. I'll tell you a little story about in Waycross, Lindsey Thomas, who was also elected at the same time, lived in South Georgia, close to, yeah, that's right. And there was a function for Lindsey after the election in Waycross at the Waycross Country Club, and Lindsey invited me to come down because Waycross was in my district. And so I did. I went down, and Luella didn't go with me. But when I came in the club, and Lindsey was standing there talking to one of his friends, I walked up, and his friend, he introduced me to his friend. He said, "This is J. Roy Rowland here." And the friend looked at me and kept talking to Lindsey. And Lindsey said, "Where's Luella?" And his friend stopped and said, "Oh, you're Luella's husband." So I told me she was all over. She had a lot to do with me being elected.
That was you had no Republican opposition.
No, and I was the only member that came to the U.S. House that time that did not have a Republican opponent. So after the primary, that was my election. That primary was put off because it got involved in a court case, and we finally had the runoff at the time of the general election. That time in November, and so after I was elected in the primary in the runoff, I had no Republican opponent, so we were able to go ahead to Washington and look for a place to live, and I was the only one in that class of about 78 new members that could do that.
Did that? Of course, that did not help your seniority. It just helped you get located in Washington.
That's all. No, it didn't help me in the seniority. No, yeah. We were all sworn in at the same time.
Was moving to Washington a culture shock?
No, not really. Culture shock? No. Luella was with me. It may have been more so if she hadn't been. I mean, our children were all grown and gone, and it was. Well, it was different in the aspect that we were living in a townhouse as compared to the home that we lived in, and meeting different kind of people. But I didn't detect the culture as being that much different.
Yeah. Shortly after you got there, there was an incident that became a controversy involving the Russians shooting down a Korean airline flight with Georgia Congressman Larry McDonald on board. There was some feeling, as I recall, that McDonald might have been the target of that. Do you recall that situation?
I do, and I recall it just as you did, that he may have been the target. It was a 007 Korean airliner that he was on that was shot down by the Russians. Larry was very conservative. He was heavily involved with the John Birch Society. In fact, I think Larry did not vote for Speaker O'Neill for Speaker, the only Democrat in the House that didn't, and he lost his seat on the Armed Services Committee because of that. But I talked with Larry on several occasions, and Larry would admonish me for some of the votes I cast, saying that they were too liberal. We had some conversations. I never did consider myself to really be a close friend of Larry's, but knew him pretty good, and I do recall that there was a conspiracy theory about that plane being targeted because he was on it.
But there's no definite conclusions?
Not that I recall.
Yeah.
No.
Well, when you arrived in Washington, it was 1983.
Yes.
Ronald Reagan had defeated Jimmy Carter for president, and the country was in, I guess, what you could call a mess. So what do you remember about those days?
Well, it was high inflation rate, high unemployment rate. The misery index, I think it was referred to at that time. I think that President Reagan had the ability to make people feel differently about what was going on. He made people feel good about the country, and that the problems could be resolved and the country could be turned around. And that was a principal thing that I think he did. He was a very charismatic person. I know Pat Schroeder, who was a member from Colorado, coined a phrase for him, the Teflon president, because anything that anybody said about him seemed to just bounce off of him, and really didn't cause a problem. But the few times that I had the opportunity to talk with him, and he'd call members to the White House to talk with them about various types of legislation. He was always a very gracious person, and very even with the way he approached things.
He was supported by a group of Southern Democrats known as boll weevils. Were you a boll weevil?
Well, they changed the name of that. The boll weevil was the name that was given to a group of conservative Democrats who were mostly from the South, but that became the Conservative Democratic Forum. And yes, I was a member of the Conservative Democratic Forum. We probably had about 35 or 40 members, Democrats, and were able to do some negotiating on some legislation. I don't think we had as much influence as the Blue Dogs have now. And most of those that were Democrats that were in the Conservative Democratic Forum either left the Congress, became Republican, or were defeated. So there was one time that there were probably not more than about, 15 or 20 in that group.
It's generally known that most of the work in Congress is done by committees. And in those committees, you either defeat or pass out bills to the floor for a vote. Would you be so kind as to explain to us how those committees are chosen?
I can tell you on the Democratic side how the members of the committee are chosen. I think the Republicans have a Republican conference, and I'm not sure just how that works, but on the Democratic side it was a Steering and Policy Committee. And there were about 30 members of the Steering and Policy Committee, members of the House. Some of them were regional, from different parts of the country, and some of them were appointed by the leadership, some by the Speaker, which of course gave the leadership and the Speaker a lot of power. The last term that I was there, I ran for and was elected to the Steering and Policy Committee to represent Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee, and South Carolina. And the committee assignments were made in the Steering and Policy Committee. So, and again, the Speaker had a great deal to do with who was elected, not always, but much of the time.
Tell us, if you will, what committees do.
Well, there are authorizing committees, like the Energy and Commerce Committee or the Public Works and Transportation Committee. They pass legislation to authorize the appropriation of money for various projects. And of course, the Ways and Means Committee has to do with taxation, determining the taxes that would be put in place. And the Appropriation Committee appropriates money that has been authorized by the authorizing committees. But that has changed a lot since I was there. We didn't have what they call earmarks now. The Appropriation Committee now can earmark stuff, and they can get money appropriated for something without it having been authorized. But when I was there, it had to be authorized before it could be appropriated. There were some monies that were appropriated before the authorization was done, but the authorization eventually had to be done. So committees authorize is what they do, the Ways and Means Committee and the Appropriation Committee.
You think earmarking is a good idea?
No, I really don't. I think it's a bad idea. There are too many trades that can be made that can affect adversely our country in general. And I think that's one of the things that has made the deficits escalate so much is the earmarking. Any member of the House is going to get what they can for their district because that helps them get reelected. So it's not a good thing, in my opinion.
Bringing home the bacon.
Bringing home the bacon, that's what it is.
Voters understand that.
Yes, they understand that.
Well, there are few issues in American politics, in my judgment, that are as misunderstood as national deficit and debt and deficit spending. And our deficit spending has increased our national debt manyfold since you were in Congress. Will we ever again have a balanced budget?
Probably not, if you mean that the amount of money that is spent equal to the amount of money that's taken in. I doubt that will ever happen again. They say that if the deficit goes up as a certain percent of the gross domestic product, and that percentage stays the same all the time, it can go up indefinitely. And that's what we did for a number of years. But now the gross domestic product has fallen and the deficit goes up, and the distance between them is much greater now, so that puts us in a precarious position. I don't think we'll ever have a balanced budget, not in the foreseeable future.
There were two incidents during your terms, that I'd like to talk about. One is the Iran-Contra situation, and the other is what was known as the First Gulf War. Would you talk to us about those?
Yes, the Iran-Contra was during, I guess it was maybe the third term that I was there, when some monies were taken through a deal with the Iranians and given to the Contras to support them, who we supported in opposition to the Sandinistas, who was a communist-type government in Central America, Nicaragua. Interestingly enough, I got involved in that to an extent that I got the attention of the leadership on the Democratic side, and that helped me get a seat on the Energy and Commerce Committee, which I had been denied for 3 terms before that. But I did have the opportunity to go to Central America, to Honduras, and visit the Contra camp there with Sonny Montgomery, who was from Mississippi. He was a retired general, and he was the chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee. And we went to Tegucigalpa, Honduras, and we boarded us. In retrospect, later I learned it was a unmarked CIA helicopter, and flew to Baca Valley to this Contra camp. And I recall the pilot was flying just above the treetops. It's very mountainous, and he was staying just above the treetops. And I said, "Why are you flying so low?" He said, "Well, if we get up very high, we might get shot down." And I thought, what am I doing here? I mean, I didn't understand the danger that we may have been in at that point. But this is at the same time that Noriega was being overthrown in Panama, and we stopped in Panama on the way there. And if you recall, our ambassador had been withdrawn from Panama at that time, and we went to the ambassador's residence and had dinner, but there was no ambassador there, and there were armed guards everywhere, and it was sort of a different time.
There was a great congressional investigation into that. You remember Oliver North and and that situation. Do you think President Reagan knew about the deal with the Contras?
Yeah, I think he knew about it, but I think he lets Oliver North manage it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think he knew about it. President Reagan, my observation was he didn't micromanage things. He generally knew what was going on, and he generally said what he wanted done, but he left it to the others to take care of the details.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about the Gulf War. That was President Bush.
Right.
Were you in favor of the Gulf War?
Yes. I was in favor of the Gulf War because I thought that Saddam Hussein was the same kind of person that Adolf Hitler was. I thought that Saddam Hussein wanted to control all the oil in the Middle East, control the economy of the world, and I felt that he had to be stopped. And that's essentially what the Gulf War did for a time. And I learned later that the reason that we stopped and did not depose him at that time was, of course, Iraq and Iran were bitter enemies, and had been in a war for several years prior to that. And the general feeling was that if Saddam Hussein was taken out, that Iran would become dominant, and in fact we have seen that happen after he was taken out with the war that's going on over there now. So I was in favor of it, and I thought it was the right thing to do to stop him.
You know, I remember watching it on television and marveling at our ability to drop those bombs through a window. Wasn't that awesome? That
was awesome.
Right.
It really was. I mean, those cruise missiles they could put it in a bucket.
That's right.
Somewhere.
It was
amazing.
Do you think that we accomplished what we should have accomplished over there during that first war? Should we have continued until we brought down Saddam Hussein, or did we withdraw at the proper time?
Well, in hindsight now, it probably would have been better to have gone ahead and done that and had a different proposal to do to follow up on the war, and I think that's what happened with this invasion of Iraq and what's going on over there now. We didn't have any follow-up. We didn't have any plan. We didn't have any way. We had not planned how to deal with it after he was removed.
What do you think that these wars have done to the financial aspects of the American government?
Made a lot of money. People have made a lot of money out of wars.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, World War II, I think World War II pulled us out of the Depression. And it's just made a lot of money for, I think it was General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower said, beware the military-industrial complex. And yeah, I think there's been a lot of money made out of it.
Yeah. Let's get back for a minute to President Reagan. He was accused during his administration of overspending on defense at the expense of programs, social and domestic programs that needed attention. Is that a fair accusation?
I think President Reagan, with what he did in defense spending, we simply outspent the Soviet Union, and I think that's what brought them down. So I give him and his philosophy and what he did a lot of credit for ending the Cold War, although created tremendous deficits.
Let's talk for a minute now about health care. You're a doctor, a very successful doctor, very popular doctor. You were in the Georgia legislature and in the U.S. Congress at a time when health care happened to be a big issue. Have we made any progress over the years in solving some of our health care delivery issues?
No, I don't think we've made any significant progress in the delivery of health care and making it available to people who can't afford it. That's a really difficult, very difficult proposition to have to deal with. it gets caught up in the politics of the time. It causes a lot of divisiveness. There's so many different entities out there that are concerned with money that they might not make or money they'll lose, and that's what it revolves around largely. The reason I think that we're not able to get some health care legislation passed that will make health care available to everyone.
Let's talk about our federal programs, Medicare and Medicaid and some of the other children's programs. Are they effective?
They're very effective, I think, for the Medicare is very effective for the elderly, and of course Medicaid for people who are poor. As a matter of fact, they do a lot more than they probably need to do. There's probably more money spent than needs to be spent. We've got Peach Care in Georgia now for children, which is certainly a good thing. But the delivery of health care still is a conundrum that is very difficult to deal with. How do you pay for it? How do you determine who's going to get what kind of care? There's a lot of different reasons why health care costs so much. I mean, look at the wonderful technology that we have now in diagnostic and treatment. That's expensive, and of course there's always a thing that trial lawyers will disagree, but that's certainly defensive medicine, the liability problem certainly adds to the cost of it. We've moved so far in technology and healthcare now. I think we've gotten to the place where we really can't pay for it for everyone.
Well, is there a solution to that?
Well, yes, but then you get into a biomedical ethical area. I mean, how are you going to decide who's going to get what? For example, in the United Kingdom, people, after they pass a certain age, can't get renal dialysis. Yeah, they make a decision about that. Well, here in this country, anybody can get dialysis who has end-stage renal disease under the Medicare program. So there's some biomedical ethical issues that you get into that you have to deal with, and it's hard.
What do you think of means testing?
I think that's a good idea. In fact, we had some legislation that I was involved with while I was there. We wanted to create some community health centers around the country. I want to create a network of community health centers that would be financed by the federal, the state, and the local government. Everyone would invest in them, and the people that went to those clinics would be provided care on a means-tested basis. So, if you were able to pay, you paid. You paid whatever you were able to pay, and if you're not able to pay anything, then you didn't pay anything. And I thought this was a way that we could provide outpatient care to many, many people in our country.
Would means testing be a good idea for Social Security?
I think we have to consider that as a possibility. I think for Medicare as well, to means test it. People who are very wealthy get the same kind of Medicare as people who are not. So I think the people who are very wealthy should pay a little more. Got a tickle in my throat here.
Okay. Let's talk for a minute, if you will, about Georgia's delegation in Congress when you were a member. Georgia's always been in a very powerful position in the Congress. We've had Carl Vinson and Phil Landrum and others, but as they left, they were replaced by a group of what I consider to be very bright and efficient members, like yourself, for example, and Ed Jenkins. You served with Ed. Tell us about Ed.
Ed's a great guy, very bright. Ed's on the Ways and Means, a lawyer. We were good friends. Ed got along with almost everybody. There was one time that Ed was being pushed to run for majority leader in the House, but he did not. I think he would have had a real good chance of being elected to that position had he chose to run. But yeah, Ed was very good. Doug Menard. Doug had a lot of background, as you know, in politics in Georgia and in the banking. he was into the banking area and had a lot of information about that.
Elliot Levitas.
Elliot was there when I came. He's a really super guy. I was kind of stunned when Elliot was not reelected one time. I think the Georgia and the country lost a great leader when Elliot was not reelected. Lindsey Thomas, who went at the same time that I did. Richard Ray. Richard, really outstanding, very, very patriotic guy, and he was Sam Nunn's chief of staff for a number of years, so he really knew what was going on in Washington. He knew the process.
You also served with Weitz Fowler, who was elected to the Senate.
Yes, Weitz was. I never did get to know Weitz really well. He ran for the Senate not long after that, but Weitz a great storyteller.
And Buddy Darden.
Buddy is a very dear friend. I've known Buddy for a long time. We were in the Georgia House together, and Buddy's wife, Lillian, her father was a Methodist minister, and I knew of her family. And Buddy came from down in Hancock County. Buddy's a real good friend. I think he was an excellent legislator. I'm sorry when he was not reelected.
How deeply are you involved in politics today?
Well, some, not really deeply. I mean, they're people that I support because I think they're good people, or because I think they'll make good leaders. So I'm still involved to some extent. I don't think I have as much influence as some people say I might have. Folks come to me and say, "Well, I'd like for you to so and so and help me." I say, I don't have that much influence anymore. I don't have any leverage anymore. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, I would like to now move ahead to the present day. We're here at the University of Georgia. It's 2009. We're involved in wars and deficits, and a very deep economic depression. I say depression, that might not be the word. But where are we headed?
Well, that's hard to say where we're headed, but where I think we are right now, we are in a sort of an unstable economic situation because of the tremendous deficits that we have seen built up over the last several years. I think the last time we didn't have a deficit, President Clinton did not have much of a deficit. But these deficits have really built up. There's been an awful lot of spending by the government on security, on the military, a lot that has been spent socially, social welfare as well. We're approaching an area of deflation, in my opinion, as compared to inflation. Deflation can be just as bad. I'm not an economist. But we've got more goods and services out there than we have money and credit. And so we see the price of things have come down a lot, and that can be just as devastating to the economy as inflation, which is just the opposite of that. I was for putting the money out as a stimulus, but I think the Secretary of the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, they did not look after the money. I think Secretary Paulson, they put the money out there, and the financial community took it, and there's no accounting for it, and it didn't do what it was intended to do. I really kind of subscribe to the Keynesian theory of economics. When there's really bad times, that the government can step in and help, but when times are good, then that money needs to be repaid. So I think we are in a period right now where the government needs to help some, but that money needs to be repaid when times get better.
Mm-hmm. How much are we in danger of China?
And you mean financially, economically?
Financial.
Yeah, well, I think that's a real danger, because they can manufacture goods so much cheaper than we can, and people want to buy things as cheap as they can. So I think that that is a real problem. But it's not just China; it's all of the countries in the Pacific Rim and the Far East that are doing this, and in Central America, South America. I mean, they produce stuff so much cheaper than we do in this country, and that puts us in a pretty unstable situation.
Well, while we're on that subject, let me ask you this question. What would you say our role should be in world affairs? Should we be as aggressive as we have been in recent times?
I don't think we can be the world policeman. I really don't. I think that we've sort of been forced into that role because we are the preeminent military power in the world. So almost every other country looks to us when there's a problem to intervene. And then when we intervene, it's not appreciated as much as it's just really not appreciated. So while I'm not an isolationist at all, I think we are stretched too thin now. Our commitments militarily.
There are those in the country who think that we spend too much money with our allies. What do you think of that?
Well, we do spend a lot of money with Israel. I've always thought about Israel as being almost an extension of our country, and they look. I felt like they looked after our interest in the Middle East to a large extent. You know, and then there's a humanitarian thing. What goes on in Africa, all of the ravages of disease and hunger and all. It's almost as though you can't stand to the side and not do something, not be involved in some of that. It just, I think we're caught in the position we're in because we have been the preeminent military power. We have been the preeminent economic power in the world. So, I mean, it seems that mantle sort of falls to us.
Mm-hmm. I heard an economist say the other day that we have reset our economy, and it will be a long time before we get back to where we were. Do you think that's a possibility?
I'm not sure what they mean by where we were. Get back to where we were.
Before all of our national debt and all the deficit spending we've been doing, and the effect it has had on the national economy, the stock market, Wall Street.
Yeah, I think we'll get back someday. I really do, but it's going to be a while, and I'm not enough of an economist to put all this together in my head, but I have enough faith in this country and the people in this country that I feel that we'll get back.
What do you think about all these bailouts?
Well, the bailouts of the financial institutions was necessary, I believe. But the money was not tracked as it should have been. It was not accounted for as it should have been. I don't think that we could have let our financial institutions fallen through. I mean, then we would have certainly been like we were back in the after 1929. We'd been right back where we were in the 1930s, and I think that's probably one of the reasons we had the Great Depression is because President Hoover at that time did not intervene. He said it'll take care of itself. The business community and the Wall Street people, it'll take care of itself, and we don't need to do anything. Well, it didn't happen that way.
Mm-hmm. So, let's talk for a minute about the war on terror. Are we going about it in the right way?
Well, we must be doing something right. We hadn't had an attack in this country now since 9/11, so I'm not into that enough to make any comment about it other than to say that I feel pretty safe.
Mm-hmm. Let's get back for a minute, Dr. Rowland, to your role in the national healthcare system as a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. There's been a lingering fear that the Medicare and Medicaid programs might run out of money. Is that a possibility?
Well, that's what the actuaries say, that that Medicare is in jeopardy. I don't know what the latest figures are. 10 or 12 years down the road, it may get to the point where it's not able to finance itself, and the same for Social Security sometime further down the road. That's certainly a danger. I mean, there's so many more people retired now for those who are working as there were, for example, when it first started.
What if that happens? What if we run out of money?
I don't think we'll run out of money. I think the full faith and credit of the United States government will see that that does not happen. I mean, I think the people will continue. The value of the money may not be as much as it is, worth as much as it is now, but I don't think it'll run. I just don't have that fear.
Well, you know much more about this than I, but as I recall, the last effort to develop a national health policy was a Clinton proposal in 1993. You were in Congress at that time. Do you think that it was a workable plan?
I don't think his was what the country needed. I was very much involved in that. If you recall, he put Mrs. Clinton in charge of that, and had a health policy person come from New England, Our Magazine, and they met for many months in the old executive officeville, and they put this plan together and excluded everyone that would be a stakeholder, the providers. I mean, the medical community was excluded, the health insurance industry, the pharmaceutical industry. They wrote what they wanted, and if you had some commercials called Harry and Louise who really took after this. But I think that they went about it in the wrong way. They didn't include the people that should have been included, and something may have come out of that, not what they presented, may have come out of that. But it was my feeling at the time that there were some things that we could do, and there was a couple of pieces of legislation that I worked with a member from Florida, Mike Billericus. We had a bipartisan piece of legislation that would have addressed such things as administrative simplification, insurance reform, create community health centers around the country, a network of them where people could go to get their care, and they would get it on a means-tested basis as well. But we were never able to get it out of committee in 1993 or 1994. 1994, there were several other pieces of health care legislation. Bob Michael was a minority leader, had one. Jim McDermott, who was a psychiatrist from Washington State, he had one. The president had one. We had one, bipartisan. There was a couple of others. Dick Gephardt told me in the summer of 1994 that after the August recess that he was going to take up all of these pieces of legislation. But after the August recess, I heard that it wasn't going to happen. I went to see him, and he said, well, people are not interested in that now. So we never did get anything out of the Congress. John Dingell, who was chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, told me, he said, Roy, your legislation will never see the light of day out of my committee. I mean, John Dingell was from Michigan, and his father had introduced a socialistic piece of health legislation when he was in the Congress back in the 30s, and Chairman Dingell had reintroduced that legislation every Congress since then, and that was, he didn't want to see anything happen that was any variation much from what his father had originally introduced. But I think we had an excellent opportunity to get something done then, but it got caught up in the politics of the time. And
we were talking about the Clinton health care program in 1993. Right.
Well, the Clintons didn't include all the stakeholders in their proposal. Consequently, there were a lot of people that were very much opposed to it. President Clinton would call small groups of members of the House to come down, and he'd make a pitch to them, and I had an opportunity to go one time. And I told him at that time that I thought it was very important for him to include the medical community and pharmaceutical community, the different groups that were going to be providers in the discussions about doing the reform, he kind of shook his head. I wasn't sure where he shook his head yes or no. I mean, he was a hard fellow to pin down. And so I asked him, I said, Mr. President, if you were going to do some reform in the judicial system, would you exclude lawyers? And he didn't answer the question. Mm-hmm. Obviously, he wouldn't exclude lawyers, but as that moved along, I had some communication with Ms. Clinton, who of course was in charge of it, and she wrote me some letters saying that she would look forward to working with me on health care reform, but I could never get a seat with the group that was working on it in the old executive office building. So in 1994, I had become chairman of the Hospital and Healthcare Subcommittee of the Veterans Affairs Committee, and they had designated one person from that committee, that subcommittee, to come, and the designee gave me his slot. I took his slot to go to those meetings, and it ended before I ever attended any of those meetings. But I felt that the president was very devious and somewhat deceitful in dealing with members of the House, and I think he thought that he could do everything without having to consult anyone else. And in the Democratic caucus, I recall the leadership, Dick Gephardt particularly, who was the majority leader at that time, saying, we can get health care reform passed and we don't need the Republicans. We can do it without them. And of course that was the downfall of the whole effort to reform health care, because it became so partisan. And the piece of legislation that I had worked on, there were 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans that worked on this legislation. We produced 2 different bills. The last one we produced, the Congressional Budget Office scored us real well on it. They said that we could ensure 96% of the people, 94% of the people in the country in 5 years, and reduce the deficit by $90 million over that period of time. At that time, full employment was considered if you had 6% unemployment. So if we were able to cover 94% of the people and 6% not being covered, we figured we'd pretty well been able to cover most of the people in the country. But we were never able to get it out of the committee, never able to get a good hearing on it. And the 10 people that worked on it, 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans, it was a good experience. I guess that health care reform legislation was my best and worst moments in the Congress. I think it was the best thing that I did, but it was the worst thing that happened to me, not getting it out.
As you look back over your career, is there anything you would have done differently?
Not that I can think of right now. I worked really hard to try to get that legislation. I think I served my constituents well. I had over 300 town meetings during the 12 years I was there, and I came home every weekend. My wife and I spent 11 weekends in Washington in the 12 years that I was there. Sometimes we went somewhere else, but most every weekend we was at home.
So you could probably say that your proudest moment as a congressman was your work in healthcare, and your biggest disappointment.
That's correct.
In Congress was your work in healthcare.
That's right.
Good.
That's correct. Yeah.
Do you think there's a way to unite healthcare providers, doctors and pharmaceutical companies and pharmacists and nurses? And
you know, money is the root of all evil, and that's where the problem lies. I think the various providers, the various stakeholders are concerned about the money that they might lose or the money that they won't make. I think if you could get the leadership and the various providers to come together and talk about some kind of reform that would provide care on a cost-efficient basis, quality care, yeah, I think it can be done. I really do.
What role should the government play in that?
The government's got to play a significant role in it because there's got to be some regulation about it. So the government's got to play some regulatory function in it. I think that not only the federal government, but state and local governments ought to be involved in investing in it too. If you invest in something, you're going to look after it better and see that it works better. And so I think that it ought to be a combination of financing, not just at the federal level.
Some people say we're headed toward socialized medicine.
We've already got some socialized medicine. We've got Medicare and Medicaid, Peach Care. We've got several programs that are socialized medicine already.
There's nothing wrong with them.
Well, financing it is a problem. And then the greed. I mean, there are providers who take advantage of it. Money again is where the big problem is.
Older people that I get from ARP, which I'm a member, seem to feel that Obama plan might affect them more drastically than it would others because of their age and the question of whether or not you want to give a 90-year-old person a new knee or a new hip. And should we worry about that, or should we do it?
Well, that's you get into a medical ethical situation, that when you decide whether or not somebody is going to get something that the doctor says that they may need, and the government will make the decision about that. We really need to have a biomedical ethical board. And by the way, we did, when I was in the Congress, we did.
Wait a minute.
It's on.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay.
We did in 1984. The Congress, Bill Gradison, who was from Ohio, and Henry Waxman from California, got some legislation passed creating a biomedical ethical board to try to look at those, look at the biomedical ethical issues. And we had 2 meetings. The first time we met, the subject of abortion came up. And the second time we met, the subject of abortion came up again, and the debates became so heated about it that the committee never met anymore. There should be some kind of public policy, and we would have to talk to medical ethicists, people who are involved in that area, to get some guidance about what needs to be done in that area. So that gets back to what will you do for somebody that needs renal dialysis. If they are past a certain age, or they have certain diseases or whatever, should they get it? A lot of decisions like that would have to be made. So it becomes very complex.
How can the majority of Americans afford private health insurance these days?
I don't think they can. I think that private health insurance is far more expensive than individuals who don't have some kind of group insurance can afford. Individuals have no leverage in purchasing health insurance. The leverage is by companies or employers that buy large groups. And I think the health insurance industry takes advantage of these people who try to buy insurance individually. I think there needs to be more insight into what health insurance companies do. I think there needs to be more information about their reserves. How much money do they have in reserves? How much are they making? I don't know that this information is available. It wasn't available at one time, and I don't know whether it is now or not, but I think health insurance companies really take advantage in many instances.
Would more government regulations correct that?
Well, the health insurance industry is largely regulated on a state basis now. but I don't know how effective that is. Federal government may have to be involved in it because you have so many different states that may have different requirements that it may need to look at it on a federal standpoint. Just like you've got the Drug Enforcement Administration that regulates drugs, pharmaceuticals, that habit forming, and so we may have to look at something like that for the health insurance industry, which I know they would oppose.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to a little politics. How has politics changed since you got involved?
Has it changed since I got in?
Except for the cost of seeking public office.
Yeah, well, it's changed that way. I don't know that politics has really changed. It seems to me it's pretty much the way it always has been. You just got to, if you want to get involved in politics, you've got to get out and convince as many people as you can that you're the right person for whatever office you're running for. But yes, it does take a lot more money now. I believe that my first campaign was around $350,000.
That's for Congress?
For Congress. Mm-hmm. And that included the runoff. I mean, that was about what I spent. And now, what is it now? $3 million or $4 million? I don't know.
$4 million, at
least. Out of sight.
Yeah. Well, has politics changed you?
I hope it's made me a better person and more appreciative of the country that we live in. I have a better understanding about it. I find myself not being as critical as I could have been had I not been involved and learned something about it in the process and what all goes on. I think that gives me an understanding. I hope it makes me a better person.
Well, your old district, as we said, the Bloody Eighth, has remained in Democratic hands since you left Congress.
Oh, well, let's see. Charlie Norwood had part of it. And
that's after reapportionment, though.
Yes.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, that's we haven't talked about reapportionment. That affected you when you were in Congress, didn't it?
Did.
They reapportioned your district.
Yeah, the last term I was there, I had 32 counties or portions of counties. Got a lot of area I didn't have: Valdosta, Albany, part of Warner Robins that I didn't have before. So yeah, it changed it a lot. Reapportionment makes a lot of changes in it, put some people out.
Yes, it did. But still, that eighth has been Democratic, and the reason I mentioned that is that the Republicans in Georgia have made a great effort to capture the 8th district.
Yeah.
And despite the fact that they have won other districts handily, they have yet to have a Republican from the current 8th.
Right. Well, I think probably Jim Marshall, he may not even have an opponent this next time, a Republican opponent, because they've thrown everything they could at him 3 times, and he got by all 3 times.
Well, let's talk a little bit about party politics in Georgia. What do you think is the reason for the Republican Party to take over after so many years of Democratic rule?
Well, I think the Democrats, quote, messed up. I think people vote against something more than they vote for something, and I think the reason we lost the governorship is because people were voting against the incumbent. And I'm not sure about why the legislature changed as dramatically as it did, unless it followed that Republican sweep.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Republican Party has been very active in the state. They have, as I see it, just outmaneuvered the Democrats with the local grassroots effort.
Yeah.
And they have recruited good candidates, and they worked hard for those candidates, and those candidates have won. But what do you think it will take, if it's possible, for the Democrats to regain the governorship and the legislature?
Well, I think it'll happen. It always does. It swings back and forth, and who knows when it'll happen. I think there's a reasonable chance that the Democrats could get the governorship in this upcoming election. I don't believe the legislature will change that much. Maybe there'll be some better Democratic candidates. You know, after you've been in an office for a while, so many people become complacent with what they've got, and they don't work as hard.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Many disenchanted, I guess is the word, Democrats feel that the state party is too urban and too dependent on minorities and labor unions. Do you think that's true?
I think that has a significant effect on it. I do. The makeup of it is a larger minority. The Republican Party doesn't have that many minority, and they do lean towards more of the labor unions. And we're a right-to-work state here, so the general population, I think, doesn't go along with that. And maybe that's, again, because they are voting against something rather than for something.
Did you ever consider switching parties?
No.
Would you switch parties?
No.
Why wouldn't you switch parties?
Well, a democratic tradition. I mean, it's just a tradition. I could be, well, I have supported Republican candidates. I was still a Democrat. I can call myself a Democrat. But when I thought the Republican candidate might be the best person for the job, again, I'm kind of a moderate, conservative person. I'm not fiercely partisan, but I do consider myself to be a Democrat.
Well, that brings up the question of cross-voting and party registration. Do you support registration by party in Georgia?
Not necessarily, no. No, not really. I think you ought to be able to cross-vote if you want to.
Do you favor term limits?
No. The people can limit terms.
That's right. A lot of people don't understand that.
Yeah.
When I hear complaints about something, I say, well, look, you already got term limits. If you don't like them, kick them out.
Take them out, and that happens. You know, I look at the U.S. House now and the membership of the U.S. House now, and I bet they're not, well, there's 435 members in the House. I bet there's not 75 members there that was there when I left.
Really?
Yeah, I think it's, I haven't counted that, but I'm just looking at it generally.
The cost of campaigning, as we've talked about, has really increased with television and computer ads and that sort of thing. Do you favor public financing of federal elections?
I think that's all right. I think it's okay to have public financing. I think it's okay like we have now. I'm not opposed to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you, but I'd like to ask you a final question. If you were a candidate today, for the Congress, what would be your platform?
My preference?
Your platform.
Oh, my platform? To get health care legislation, to get some kind of health care legislation passed, because that's the thing that I'm most familiar with. Mm-hmm. And I would again support a constitutional amendment for a balanced budget. I think that is really important. Those would be the two things that I would be most interested in. And then, of course, I come from a rural area, so you know the farmers are difficult. That's a hard avocation. The farmers need some help, and so you know I would look at that as part of a platform too.
Well, you certainly had a very exciting and successful career in both medicine and politics. And we appreciate what you've done for Georgia. And I want to thank you on behalf of Young Harris College and the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia for being our guest.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor and a privilege to be in public office in the State House and the U.S. House. And I really do appreciate the opportunity to come here and talk about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.